Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a solo episode, and I have a topic I want to dive into, and that's 6 ways to improve your bicep training for muscle growth. But first, before I dive into that, I just want to go over a few ways you can help support the podcast. So first, if you are sick of just focusing on weight loss and instead want a body recomp, then my one-on-one online coaching program is for you. I help you lose body fat and build muscle with my body recomp training, nutrition, and lifestyle methods. Again, these are all things that I talk about on this podcast. We look at things like your lifestyle and biofeedback to individualize your training and nutrition program to you and your specific needs. And there's also at least 1 to 2 bottlenecks that we figure out that are keeping you from seeing the results that you want to see. And this is outside of the training and nutrition protocol. And again, these typically hold people back more than they think. If you're interested in learning more, there's a link in the show notes and you can check out the service. You can also reach out to me on Instagram if you have any questions on this and we can continue this conversation further. If you aren't interested in full coaching, I do one-on-one consultation where we troubleshoot any issues you have and or map out a game plan for the next couple months. If you want to learn more about a body recomp, I have my free 75-minute masterclass on body recomp, what it is, how to do it, and you can find the link to that in the show notes. Next, you can follow me on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_, and that's where I'm most active on social media. And if you have any questions or anything like that, you can reach out to me there. And then lastly, if you found this podcast to be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, and that will help more people find this podcast. And I appreciate everybody who listens to this podcast. So with that out of the way, let's dive into today's topics. Are you struggling to build your biceps or you just want to get them bigger? If so, then we're going to go over 6 ways that you can improve your bicep training. And I think I'm going to add one more actually as I'm thinking about this. We'll see how this flows, but expect a bonus one. I guarantee there's at least 1 to 2 things that you aren't currently doing on this list right now. So make sure you listen. All right. My first one here is going to be limit barbell / straight bar / easy curl bar work. So I used to do these all the time. I'm sure you did as well too. I remember back in the day, my dad I used to use a lot of dumbbells, which I think are great for bicep training, but he also had that one of those straight bars and you could like screw the weight on and whatnot. And I would do a lot of those straight bars with that. And then just at the gym as well too. I remember my buddies during, I think it was one of our PE classes in high school, we would do squats and then we would go in the other room and there was like the 30, 40 pound straight bars. And I think we would I can't remember how exactly we did it, but we'd pass it back and forth. We would do like 1 rep, then you do 1 rep, then you'd pass it back, you do 2, then do 2, and you'd work your way up as high as you could go basically with it. So just a background there on like how I would use these. And then I'd use easy curl bar over time as like that kind of started to hurt my elbows and whatnot. And as I've gotten more experience here, I'm not a fan of these for bicep work because of the lack of kind of like freedom of the range of motion, right? And they end up placing a lot of stress on the elbow joint, leading to potential overuse injuries, right? I think this is where a lot of people get kind of some of those niggles and like tendonitis and stuff like that. And not to mention, people tend to use a little bit too much weight for these movements, which makes the issue worse. The big issue is that you don't have that kind of freedom of where you can, how you execute the lift, right? You're in that fixed position there with the straight bar, especially the straight bar. And the easy curl bar, it can be a little bit better because it can take a little bit of stress off of the elbows there as well too. And so for these, what I like to do is I like to stick with cables and dumbbells for the most part, is these allow you to set up in a way that reduces stress on the wrists and elbows, which in turn, over time, is going to allow for you to have more productive training, stay injury-free, and continue to push. So that's the main reason there why I push for that. Plus, I think with that freedom of how you can set up and stuff like that, it can really allow you to set it up in a way that maximizes it for your body type and structure and whatnot. So you can really place more tension on the biceps there with that. Cables and dumbbells have been huge, and those are probably the 2 most common things that I will use for bicep training for myself and clients moving forward. Very rarely do I do any more barbell, straight bar, easy curl bar stuff. I just found that to be very tough on the joints. All right, so number 2, there's been a lot of talk here about stretch mediated hypertrophy, lengthened position, etc. Number 2 is don't neglect the lengthened position. A lot of times when people don't use good technique, usually from using too much weight or like using barbells, stuff like that, they end up neglecting the portion of the lift where their biceps are lengthened. And this is at the bottom when the biceps are stretched, okay? So we want to make sure we are spending more time in the lengthened position. 2 exercises that are great for this are going to be face away cable curls. And we want to make sure we keep our elbows behind our body when we're doing these. Dumbbell preacher curl is another one. Now, any dumbbell type stuff is going to be solid, but these 2 in particular really place a lot of tension in that lengthened position. And we can really maximize that potential benefit there of training in the lengthened position. Now, there's been a lot of research on it. There's a lot of promise, but it's probably not everything. And so we don't want to just rely on this, but if you look at your bicep training and you're like, man, you know what? I actually don't do any of those exercises. I just do a lot of straight bar work and I really don't get that good stretch in my bicep. This is something that I think could have a pretty good return on investment for you, especially if you haven't done it. Now, if you've been doing this, continue to make sure you do it, but realize that you're probably room for improvement with this is probably a little bit lower than somebody who's never done it before, because that is one of the, as of this minute recording this on November 1st, 2023, does working in the lengthened position, is it better for muscle growth in all muscle groups? And we don't know that for sure yet. And then two, is this, I know another kind of, I can't think of the word right now. Another reason why people aren't necessarily sold on lengthened work too is like a novel stimulus. So if you haven't really done this before, it probably is going to be really helpful to implement it for a period of time, but that really slows down over time, which, I mean, really you could think about that for anything. Same thing with muscle growth. It's like when you first start training, everything's going to have a larger kind of stimulus for you. And then obviously as you do it longer and longer, the things start to slow down. So those are the two big pushbacks on the lengthened work. So just keep that in mind. I still think it's a good idea to spend a pretty good amount of time there. And just at the end of the day, just make sure you don't neglect that aspect of it. Number 3, implement progressive overload. A big mistake made with bicep training is just chasing the pump and then never applying progressive overload. I don't know what I was going to say there, but with the biceps, so that's a big mistake, right? I think people try to chase the pump too much with their biceps. I can just get a good pump and I'm good to go. And probably that's not going to be a bad strategy for a while. But I think if you are somebody who's struggling to grow their biceps, this is something that you're really going to focus on here. Really focus on progressive overload, track your numbers and make sure you're increasing over time. Again, you don't have to do this week over week, but make sure you're increasing and focus less on just the pump and focus more on like actually making sure you're getting stronger. Track these and then focus on adding reps, weight, whatever it might be. I will say with the biceps, you're likely going to have to make more rep and set increases versus just weight increases. It's going to be a lot more challenging to just continue to add weight on the biceps, right? Take a dumbbell bicep curl. Maybe initially you make some nice jumps, but once you get to 20, 25, 30 pounds, 35, it's like you're going to be at those weights for a long period of time. And so you're going to have to make more of you're going to have to overload in these other aspects of it. And saying that, over time, you do want to get stronger. Just don't expect this to happen quickly with this muscle group. And one thing too, this is just a good thing to talk about overall. And this kind of goes back to the lengthened work as well too. If you're somebody who has been doing it a certain way, you're not happy with your results, you might hear from one fitness person or professional where, oh, hey, you don't need to do this. It's better to do it this way. Or, hey, this isn't better for muscle growth than this strategy. And I think you need to be careful with that. I think you should, if you're somebody who's been training a certain way, you're not happy with your results, I think it's useful to try different things to see if it does work, especially if you're stuck in this, I don't plateaued, et cetera, right? Even if maybe someone says, oh, hey, this isn't better doing it this way. This is more so a side tangent, but I think that's something that you need to look at, right? Obviously, if you're not happy with where your results are at, you need to look into potentially changing things up slightly. Okay, so number 4, maintain/improve technique/execution. Too often with bicep training, I see people use way too much weight and end up swinging the weight around and putting too much stress on other muscle groups and joints, tendons. And again, this leads to overuse injuries like tendonitis. We want to just make sure we're not just throwing the weight up just because, right? Or because we want to have the heaviest curls in the gym or something like that. Bicep training, I think you need to be, I don't think you need the mind muscle connection, the name of the podcast. Obviously, it's not for the mind muscle connection. It was like, hey, muscle growth, building your brain, et cetera. That's where I came up with the name. But from the mind muscle connection standpoint, I do think that I don't think you should just be flying weight around and not paying attention to it, but overly focused on the mind muscle connection probably isn't going to be great for for maximizing muscle growth development. But in saying that, I think the biceps are definitely a muscle group where you don't just want to throw the weight around. Like you want to probably focus a little bit more on the mind muscle connection than you would say for other muscle groups, just because again, it's you're just working a smaller muscle group overall there on that. I do think you need to be a little bit more methodical with your execution of the lift and technique, because again, I think it's easy to start to go a little too heavy and then you start to place extra stress on joints, elbow joint, or other muscle groups, your forearm, et cetera, right? You can start to, hey, it's supposed to be a bicep exercise, but now you're flinging the weight up, you're moving your shoulders too much. Now it's more of a forearm, shoulder, and hip exercise than an actual bicep exercise. And that's not going to be great because those muscle groups should be resting in that state. Not necessarily resting, but they shouldn't be taking the brunt of the stimulus. Your biceps should be. If you're somebody that trains your biceps a ton and you're just not seeing the muscle growth that you want to, this would be a good sign that you need to potentially look at your execution of that movement. And again, heavy weights, usually the biggest culprit there with that. So number 5, slow down the eccentric portion of the lift. I see too many people just let the weight fall without controlling it on the way down. And again, this usually stems from too much weight. And this goes back to number 4, where if you're doing this, you're going to start to put stress on other joints, muscle groups, etc. We want to control the weight on the way down. And I think 1 to 3 seconds on the way down is perfect. You don't have to sit there and do 10 seconds on the way down or some super slow movement, but we do want to make sure we control that weight on the way down. If you don't do that, the weight's probably too heavy and you're missing out on a very important part of the muscle growth process of the range of motion, right? We have the eccentric, which is the lowering part, the concentric, which is the raising of it. The concentric's important, where you're really going to see that benefit from hypertrophy training is going to be that eccentric portion. So we want to make sure we control that all the way down. Again, you don't have to go super slow, but just control it. They've shown that people that go super slow, at that point now you just have to, you start to use weight that's just too light. It's not going to be stimulative enough. So there is that kind of Goldilocks zone of the eccentric. You don't want to go too fast, but you also don't want to go too slow. And I think if you do anything from 1 to 5 seconds, you're fine. I think if we want to tighten that range, 1 to 3 seconds is perfect. Number 6, implement intensity techniques. So the biceps are a great muscle group to implement intensity techniques for. These are going to be things like lengthened partials. So lengthened partials would be, again, if you don't do this, you don't spend a lot of time in the lengthened position, this would be super beneficial. But this is where instead of doing a full range of motion set, you just do that bottom 60 to 70% range of motion that you're doing partials, but they're in that lengthened position. And we're taking advantage of that potential benefit of the lengthened position there with it. So doing something like that, you could do myo rep / rest pause set. So again, this is where maybe you do a couple straight sets and then you rest for 10 to 20 seconds. You try to get as many reps as you can, or you try to get an assigned number or assigned like RIR, where it's like, hey, you're going to do your 2 straight sets at 2 RIR. And then that third set's going to be a rest pause set. You're going to hit 2 RIR on that as well too. Or you could do a myo rep style where you do a couple straight sets and then you rest for 20-ish seconds and then you try to get as many reps as you can with good technique, right? So you can implement that. That's an easy way to implement more volume. And I find that the bicep is a great muscle group for that because it doesn't require a ton of stability, right? You could do supersets. So you could do like a more like shortened overload movement, something like cable spider curls, superset with a dumbbell incline curl or a face away cable curl. You can do those 2 things, right? You're going to get a movement that kind of is a little bit more shortened bias, like a spider curl. And then you get one that's more focused on the lengthened position there with that. And that can be a good way to go about it as well too. Drop sets would be like you do your straight sets and then you do 2 to 3 sets where you drop weight and just try to get as many reps as you can as well too. These can be a great way to implement progressive overload as the training phase goes on as well too. So it's like maybe you do straight sets for the first 3 to 5 weeks of your training cycle, then the last 2 to 3 you add these in, and that's a way to progressively overload in that training cycle. And again, the biceps are great for these intensity techniques as well too. And then the bonus one that I was going to say, number 7, was this would be something that I would focus on these things first, but another thing you could potentially do here as my bonus number 7 one is there's been some research lately showing that higher volumes do really help with muscle growth, right? Or you probably want to try to do, if you really want a muscle group to grow as you get advanced, trying to find ways to get more volume in is going to be key there. You can't do that for every single muscle group. There's this concept of specialization phases that I've talked about a lot recently. And what you could do here is put most of your stuff on maintenance, most of your muscle groups. When I say stuff, I meant muscle groups. And then biceps, maybe you slowly ramp up your volume on that. So where it's like week 1, you're at like 10 to 12, week 2, you're at like 12 to 15, week 3, you're at like 15 to 18, and you work your way up to 25 to 30 sets. Again, this is an extreme example. I don't think you necessarily need to do that. I would start with smaller increases first, but this is something that you could potentially do, right? And by keeping everything else at maintenance, you're going to have a lot more freedom to be able to push your bicep training. Again, where that number ends up, whether it's 25 to 30, whether it's 30 to 40, 40 to 50, you'll need to test it out and see. Obviously, the issue you run into with these really high volumes is overuse injuries. We already talked about how biceps are at a little bit of a higher risk of that in general because of the fact that it's like for all your pulling movements, you are doing some bicep work, right? So you could potentially count your back work towards that. That could count towards those 30 to 40 sets. So just keep that in mind. That's why I'm saying if you go down this route, first, do all these things I talked about first. And then second, if you do this for a mesocycle or 2 and you still aren't seeing the results you want to see from a bicep standpoint, you could start to implement this specialization phase where you ramp up the volume throughout the on 1 to 2 muscle groups. In this case, obviously the bicep. Give that a shot. And then, but what I was going to say on that is just instead of going straight to these really high volumes. Maybe the first mesocycle you push 20 to 25 and see what happens. And then maybe the next mesocycle you push 25 to 30 to see what happens. And then maybe you take a break for an extended period of time from doing that and you focus on other muscle groups. And then the next time you come by, it's, hey, I did 25, I got up to 25 to 30. I felt like I could do a little bit more. Then maybe you push 30 to 35, right? Versus, in some of these studies, they show like up to 50 sets per week. It's instead of going from 15 sets straight to 50 in your first meso, let's ease up to that and see how you respond to it. Because it's much better, to me, it's much better to do less volume than to overshoot volume. I would much rather you do the first part of that than the second part. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully you're able to take away 1 to 2 things to help improve your bicep training. And that's it for now. And I will chat with you next time.